you. First, I want to thank Peter Easton for the opportunity. 4:30 on a Saturday evening, I'm not feeling any pressure. Peter didn't ask me to keep this general, but by the nature of the paper, I have to, as you'll see. It's a very non-controversial paper, sailed through the review process, published in the Journal of Accounting Research last year. The title of the paper is Do Industry-Level Analyses Improve Forecasts of Financial Performance? And joined with Patty Fairfield at Georgetown and Terry Ahn at Indiana. Essentially, the motivation of the paper is pretty straightforward. Mean reversion in firm performance is pretty well documented. Going back to Freeman, Olson, and Penman, 1982. Again, the concept of mean reversion essentially, is a phenomenon that if firm performance deviates from some kind of a benchmark, either it's too high or too low, there's a tendency for it to get back to whatever the benchmark is. And the simplest form of this is where the performance at time t is expressed as a function of performance in time t minus 1. And beta, the coefficient, is the rate of mean reversion, how quickly performance mean reverts to the benchmark. So a beta of 0 would essentially mean that it's a quickly mean reverting process. Beta of 1 would be a fully persistent random walk type process. And in general, studies find that it's between 0 and 1, consistent with partial mean reversion. The nice thing with the mean reverting property of earnings or profitability is that it helps predict future performance. In fact, Fama and French, in their 2000 Journal of Business paper, look at mean reversion, document it, and essentially advocate that if you want to forecast profitability, just like analysts do, you should take into account mean reversion in profitability. Sure enough, there are studies that find that if you incorporate the mean reverting property of profitability into your forecasts, you come up with more accurate predictions. But where we come in is that the evidence so far is based on these pooled models, right? So when you run that regression, pooling all the firms across the economy, implicitly the assumption is that the benchmark is one that is economy-wide. Everybody is mean reverting to kind of the same benchmark. And the second assumption is that the rate of mean reversion is constant across firms. Now, what we do is we come in and say, but that may not be true because industries may have their own benchmarks. We relax the assumption and say, what happens if we run this thing separately by industry? So essentially what we do is we compare the accuracy of out-of-sample forecasts that we make, and we run for every firm year observation. We make two predictions. The first prediction is coming out of the economy-wide model, and we compare that to the prediction from a mean reverting model estimated by industry. So we look at two measures of profitability, return on equity and return on net operating assets, and we look at three measures of growth, sales, book value, and net operating assets. Now, the question is, should industry matter? And why should the industry-specific model, the one that we run where we don't have the restriction that all of them revert to the same benchmark, why should that do better than an economy-wide model? Now, the economic argument is that the benchmark may differ across industries, right? So, for example, barriers to entry. So companies or industries could, kind of have this big wall, protect their profits, and therefore they do not mean revert to some kind of economy-wide average. Instead, each industry establishes its own benchmark, right? And if you're in an industry with higher risk, essentially your profitability is going to be higher. So other arguments that can be made are, the rate of mean reversion may differ. For example, the beta that we looked at between 0 and 1, it need not be the same across industries, right? In certain industries where the entry barriers, again, are pretty high, the mean reversion coefficient may be a lot larger, right? Signifying that it takes a long while for these abnormal, performance measures to dissipate. And other things like capital intensity. If it's a capital-intensive industry, it's very hard for other firms to enter the industry and try to dissipate or take away these profits. And finally, because it's an accounting rate of return, you could have differences, in just the accounting methods that could drive, the rate of mean reversion. So again, the expectation is that the industry should matter. Running these industry-specific models is going to help us come up with better predictions of firm performance. And finally, this is widely expected or assumed, right? Almost every paper that we've seen in this conference, for example, somehow controls for industry, right? Textbooks advocate that, anytime we do an analysis, if you're looking at Ford, you have to compare it to GM, right? And analysts follow firms in the same industry, so it must be the case that there's something, common between these firms, that analysts are minimizing their costs of learning, right? And therefore, they follow firms in the same industry. Finally, cost of capital studies. For example, the paper this morning, right? Anytime you need some kind of assumption about long-run profitability, it's not uncommon to assume that, over 12, 15 years, the rate of return for the firm kind of fades to, some kind of industry benchmark. And, finally, anytime we don't find what we're supposed to find, we always blame it on the industry definition, right? Could it be that, SIC is not a good way of defining industries? Maybe we should use GICS and so on. So there's almost this disbelief that, how can it not happen, right? How can the industry not be important? Now, why might not industry-specific models be superior? Again, all we need is that firms within the industry have some kind of dissimilarity, right? And, the economic argument is that in the long run, no industry can have barriers that are big enough that you can sustain abnormal profits, right? And, in the industrial organization and strategy literatures, this is the subject of heated debate, right? I mean, it's almost like the market efficiency type debate. There are ones who believe and ones who don't. And basically what they argue about is what determines firm performance. Right? There are people who believe that it's all about industry, right? Industry characteristics like concentration, and dominance by firms. It's those kinds of things basically drive firm performance. And there are others who believe that it's all firm characteristics, right? Firms determine their own destiny. The fact that they belong to a certain industry doesn't make much of a difference. And there's some evidence in accounting studies and finance, right? Going back to Brown and Ball in 1967, they look at the contribution of the economy, the industry, and the firm to overall profitability of the firm. And the industry contribution is pretty minimal to the overall firm profitability. And Barber and Lyon, 96 paper, they basically look at how do you isolate abnormal performance? The best way to do it is by matching on prior performance. So matching on industry doesn't really matter much again. So these are kind of tangential evidence in the accounting and finance literatures that maybe the industry doesn't matter. Now we look at these two different performance metrics. We look at growth, we look at profitability. And essentially, the effect of the industry need not be the same across all of these metrics. So in some metrics, we may find that the industry-specific model actually helps, but there could be others where, it may not help as much. And particularly, if there is any place we're going to find these industry effects, we expect that to be in sales for a couple of different reasons. When you look at sales growth, most of the industry definitions, if you look at, the SIC codes or the GICS, are based on commonality in the product markets. So, they basically group firms based on, where they get their revenues from. And, from an accounting standpoint, sales is not as subject to accounting choices, for example, FIFO or LIFO or different depreciation methods. Now, again, continuing on that point, we expect sales growth to do better than profitability. And, there's some evidence. Again, paper is not focused on this particular issue, but, the evidence is consistent. For example, Kinney and Collins, they look at the usefulness of segment data, right? So instead of making one forecast of revenues or earnings for a firm, you take the segment approach, try to forecast it for the segment, then aggregate it. They find that they can predict revenues using segment data, but they cannot predict profits. Or there's no improvement in using the segment data while predicting profits. Ghiberly, Hain, and Souza again look at the correlation between the revenues of the firm and the revenues of the industry, and they find that to be pretty high. But when they do the same thing for profitability, the correlation between firm profitability and industry profitability is not as good. And finally, if you can predict or if there's commonality in the top line but not in the bottom line, then something's happening in the middle. And again, there's evidence that shows that the cost structures of firms are pretty different. And if we have that kind of variability, even within an industry, our industry-specific model may not actually improve forecasts of profitability. We make out-of-sample predictions, like I said, between 1989 and 2003. Our industry classification uses GICS. Bojraj, Lee, and Oler show that it's a much better way of defining the industry. And what we do is we estimate that simple model that I showed you. It's a rolling 10-year estimate. Okay, so if we want to make prediction for 1992, we just use data from 82 through 91, get the coefficients, make the predictions. And we run it by industry, we run it by, pooled, and, essentially our tests are very simple. It's just a matched pair test. You have two sets of forecasts for a firm or predictions, one coming out of the industry-specific model, one out of the economy-wide model. And we test to see if the industry-specific model produces more accurate forecasts. And here's the non-controversial part. When we look at the predictions a year ahead, what we find is that only sales growth predictions are improved when we use the industry-specific model. And when we, none of the other growth measures, book value or net operating assets, we cannot improve the forecast by using an industry-specific model. And, none of the profitability measures work either. So return on equity, return on net operating assets, there's absolutely no improvement on average when we use the industry-specific model. Again, the concept of mean reversion, even though it's operationalized generally in the literature as a 1 year ahead, it seems reasonable that mean reversion doesn't happen immediately. It could happen 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Could be a long-run phenomenon. So we look at, we try to make the same predictions 5 years ahead to see if that, improves the, the industry-specific models, makes it better. And again, what we find is all the growth predictions improve when we go to a 5-year horizon. So it seems like, the industry effect, is a long-run effect when it comes to net operating assets and book values and so on. So it actually helps us better predict growth. All three measures, again, the sales growth, the industry-specific models do really well. And, but still, nothing for return on equity or return on net operating assets. And anytime you find something like that that is, kind of hard to convince people about, the rest of the paper is all about robustness. Okay, try to define everything differently, try to see that, make sure that it works. And we actually find, I should call it comforting evidence rather than further evidence, because we do find some results that make a lot of sense to us. So the first thing we do, of course, is, you have to define it based on 2-digit, 3-digit, 4-digit. I mean, we do all of that stuff with NAICS. We still don't find industry-specific models doing any better than the economy-wide models. And, the nice thing is, even though on average the industry-specific model doesn't help, there are certain industries where it does really well. And our top 4 are all utilities. It's electric, gas, water. So again, with rate regulation and the uniqueness of that industry, it's kind of heartening to see that it's not that the industry-specific model doesn't work, it's just that it doesn't work for all industries, or on average, it doesn't do better. So we also look at, what kind of characteristics of industries are associated with this improved predictions, because we do find, there's a lot of variation across industries. We find, of course, like I told you, regulated industries works really well. Industries dominated by large firms, somehow the predictions are better. And the industries with high barriers to entry, which again makes sense because now your benchmark is more defined by the industry than by the rest of the economy. Here's another one that gives us confidence is that the sales model works really well for every definition. It works for NAICS except not as strong. And it's always good to go and see why it is. And the NAICS is the only grouping which is based on production processes rather than on product markets. So again, It's a very simple parsimonious one variable model. We do run the the Farmer-French version, which was about 6 or 7 additional variables, but the relative predictive accuracy is still not improved when we use the other models. Okay, I'm almost done. And here is again more evidence. We look at analyst forecasts to see what the analysts do. Why is it that they follow firms in the same industry? We're finding this mixed evidence with the performance metrics, and we look at their sales growth and ROE forecasts. These are value line forecasts a year ahead, and essentially what we find is consistent with what we find. The sales growth forecasts are more closely associated with our industry-specific model predictions, whereas the ROE forecasts are more consistent with our economy-wide predictions, which is basically what we were saying is, the ROE forecasts or the predictions don't get any better with the industry-specific model. And this to us was an important part of the paper. Like I said, with cost of capital studies, you typically make the assumption about, where does the firm performance go or ROE go, cash flow forecast, right? To make your cash flow forecast, where does it go over the longer horizon? Typically, people assume it reverts to the industry median, right? And the problem with that assumption, if it is not true, or if there is no support for it, is that if you overestimate your cash flow forecast, you're going to overestimate your implied cost of capital. And so, assuming that everything gravitates to the industry median, essentially is going to elevate your forecasts of, for the, in a highly profitable industry. You overestimate your cash flows, you're going to overestimate your cost of capital. Okay, so we believe it's kind of important to see this. And when we track the actual evolution of ROE of firms over 3, 6, 9, and 12 years, we actually find that the return on equity is closer to an economy-wide benchmark than it is to an industry-specific benchmark. So empirically, we don't find much support for the assumption. Implications, again, all we want to do here is maybe bring out the notion that maybe the industry effects are not as strong as we generally think about it. And more importantly, it varies across performance metrics. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise, but we thought it was important to bring out the fact that profitability models don't seem to improve with the industry-specific models. The assumed path may lead to systematic biases, like I said, and again, we have a tendency to go look for better definitions of industry. Maybe we could look at, should we even find a high correlation, right? Maybe it doesn't exist is one of the things we would like to suggest, or at least more research is required on that. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Was non-controversial, right? Okay. Thank you very much.
Wait. You got a question from Phil. Phil has a question.
Oh, there is a question. Okay.
I was going to ask you if you used, I know you have other work that defines the industry relative to the analysts following, and whether you use that as a definition, and whether that made a difference.
No, we didn't try that because my dissertation paper, I could only group about 440 firms. So that's very restrictive because you need 5 analysts, minimum of 5 analysts, to actually do that. We could have tried something with a lower number of analysts, but given what we find across all of the definitions, we didn't believe it was worthwhile. So, Lane.
Another question?
So you said that this actually was a controversial finding. Can you give us a little bit of background on the sort of pushback you got when you made the statement the first time?
It took us about 6 years to get it published, so I mean, it was generally that you can rule out about 10 explanations, which is what we kind of do, as to why we don't find what we find, but there could be 1,000 others, which, it's kind of hard to address that, but it wasn't smooth sailing. I was being sarcastic.
Nice. Vicky?
Yeah.
So I think in an earlier version of the paper, did you guys used to control for also the change in your profitability variable and the growth in the denominator? And I think if you did, why did you decide to drop that from your model?
change in profitability?
Yeah, so, you know, kind of the base model, the RNOA plus the change in RNOA, and then the growth in the denominator. Am I wrong in the earlier
No,
version? I think you tried
that's a different paper, right? I mean, oh yeah, we did have.
Like
Yeah.
5 years ago?
Yeah. It was a much older version. I mean, you know, the history of the paper is it started out as, you know, we were trying to improve the previous paper by Patty and Terry, which broke up, you know, return on operating assets into asset turnover and profit margin, and we were trying to do the same thing at the industry level.
Right.
So we had a bunch more variables, but yeah, it
So
evolved.
just to kind of follow up, then you don't recall if including the change variable in the denominator
No.
helps at all?
The biggest one is, you know, most of the predictive power just comes from the previous year's performance. And, you know, the rest of it will lower it a little, but I don't think it definitely did not improve the relative accuracy, which is one reason why we dropped it.
At the end of the paper. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And,